"I'm only good for cooking," she whispered, and she said it to the flour on her hands rather than to the man standing in the barn doorway, because she could not make herself look up and watch his face while she said it. Her name was Sarah Jane Whitfield, and she was 26 years old, and she was standing in the smokehouse of the Calloway Ranch at 6 o'clock in the morning with ash on her sleeves and a burn already rising red across the back of her wrist, because the smoking fire had flared wrong in the night, and she'd gone in barehanded to save what meat she could before it was ruined, the way she always went in barehanded to save whatever needed saving, because that was the only kind of woman anybody in this county had ever let her be. "Let me see that wrist," said Wade Calloway, and he did not ask. He simply crossed the smokehouse floor and took her arm in both his big hands, gentle as a man handling a newborn calf, and turned it toward the gray morning light coming through the door. "It's nothing," Sarah Jane said. "I've had worse." "That isn't the point," Wade said, and there was something low and rough in his voice that had not been there a moment before. "The point is, you shouldn't have had to have worse. Not here. Not on my land." She pulled her wrist back gently, because she did not trust herself to stand that close to him and keep her composure, and she looked down at the ruined batch of venison hanging blackened on its hooks, and she said the thing she had been telling herself since she arrived at this ranch 4 months ago, the thing that kept her small enough that nobody could accuse her of wanting more than her place allowed. "I'm only good for cooking," she whispered. "That's all I ever claimed to be. Wade Calloway, the richest cattleman in 3 counties, a man who owned more grazing land than anyone between the river and the ridge, looked at her for a long moment in that ash-smelling morning light, and then he said the words that would turn her whole, careful, small life inside out. You're wrong about that, and I don't intend to let you leave here believing it. If you have ever made yourself small so that nobody would notice you enough to hurt you, if you have ever believed the only value you carried was in your hands and never in your heart, then stay through to the end of this story, because it was written for you. I'll be in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. Hit that subscribe button if stories like Sarah Jane's feel like they belong to you too, and settle in, because what happened at the Calloway Ranch that autumn would change the way an entire county understood the worth of a woman nobody had bothered to really look at. Until one rich cowboy finally did. 4 months before that morning in the smokehouse, Sarah Jane Whitfield had come walking up the long dirt road to the Calloway Ranch with a bundle on her back and blisters on both feet, because she had walked the last 6 miles after her horse threw a shoe and she had not had the money to spare for a farrier along the way. She was a widow of 2 years, her husband taken by a fall from a green horse he'd been paid too little to break, and in the years since, she had learned exactly what a woman without a husband and without children was worth in the eyes of a farming county. Very little, and that little always measured strictly by the usefulness of her hands. She had heard, from a woman at the last town's boarding house, that the Calloway Ranch was looking for a cook on account of the housekeeper having left with no notice to marry a man in Abilene, and that the ranch's owner was a widower himself with 4 children and no time to see to a proper household. Sarah Jane had walked those last 6 miles thinking only of the position of a roof and wages and something steady under her feet after 2 years of picking up whatever work a woman alone could find, which was never much and never paid fair. She had not expected to find at the end of that road a ranch house gone quiet with grief in every room and 4 children who had learned, each in their own particular way, how to survive a mother's death without anyone quite teaching them how. There was Amos, 14, the eldest, a boy who had taken it upon himself to run the household books and the hired hand schedules both, because his father had gone so quiet with grief that someone needed to, and who wore the exhaustion of that responsibility on his young face like a coat 2 sizes too heavy for him. There was Della, 12, whose grief had turned to fury the way greenwood turns to smoke before it ever properly burns, and who picked fights with her brothers over nothing and everything, because fury was easier to hold than sorrow. There was Nathaniel, 8, called Nate by everyone who had not spoken since the funeral, who spent his hours out behind the barn drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, horses mostly, and once, Sarah Jane noticed with an ache in her chest, a woman's face that he rubbed out again almost as soon as he'd finished it, like he could not bear to look at what he'd made, nor bear to leave it there either. There was little Ivy 5, who had taken to following the ranch hands around asking to smell their shirts, because her mother had always smelled of sweet clover soap, and Ivy was terrified in the plain, unashamed way small children fear such things, that she would wake up one morning and not remember that smell at all. And there was baby Thomas, not yet walking, who cried through most of the night, every night, as though his small body carried the grief the rest of the house was too proud or too frightened to let out. And there was Wade Calloway himself, 36 years old, built like the land he worked, a man who had turned a modest inherited spread into the largest cattle operation in the county through nothing but relentless, unglamorous labor and a good eye for breeding stock, and who had, in the 16 months since his wife Clara died of childbed fever after bringing Thomas into the world, gone silent in a way that worried every man who rode for him. He did not shout. He did not drink to excess, though a lesser man in his position might have. He simply stopped saying the second half of anything that mattered, until the men on his ranch had learned, the same as his children had, to let those unfinished sentences lie where they fell. Sarah Jane had a rule, 3 parts, built in the 2 hard years since her own husband's death, and she followed it like scripture, because it was the only scripture she had left that made any sense to her. Never let them see you cry. Never ask for more than the bare minimum. Always give the credit to someone else. It was not wisdom. It was a wall, built stone by stone around whatever soft places in her were still capable of being hurt, and she had gotten very skilled at living behind it. She had not expected that 4 grieving children and 1 silent rancher would spend 4 months, quietly and almost without her noticing, taking that wall apart 1 stone at a time. It began, as these things always begin, in small ways. Amos, worn thin from carrying a household's worries on shoulders still growing into a man's frame, snapped at her one evening over a cracked plate, and instead of defending herself, Sarah Jane only said, "You've been doing 3 jobs and sleeping like you're doing 1. Go on to bed. I'll see to the rest," and watched the boy's carefully held composure crack for just a moment before he turned away so she wouldn't see it crack further. It was Della, 2 weeks in, deliberately upending a basin of wash water across the kitchen floor, glaring like she wanted to be sent away and spare herself the disappointment of being kept, and Sarah Jane simply fetching a mop and saying, "Water spills. Floors. Dry. Grab the other end of this rag and help me, would you?" And something in the girl's shoulders coming down, slow like a fence post finally settling into ground that had been fighting it. It was Nate, silent Nate, one evening, sliding a stick drawing of a horse across the dirt toward her boot without a word, and Sarah Jane crouching down to study it properly, the way you'd study a fine painting, and saying only, "That's a good, strong horse, Nate. You've got a real eye," and watching something in the boy's thin shoulders ease, just barely, at being truly seen. It was little Ivy, one dusk in the kitchen garden, going still and frightened the way she did, and Sarah Jane kneeling down and crushing a sprig of the sweet clover that grew wild along the fence line, holding it up for the girl to smell. "There," she said. "Now you've always got a place to find her." Ivy had cried then hard, the unguarded crying of a small child who's finally been given permission to grieve out loud, and Sarah Jane had held her without a word, because she had learned, in her own private grief, that some sorrow only needs a witness, not an answer. And it was Wade. It was Wade lingering in the kitchen doorway more evenings than he would have admitted to any hand on the place, watching her manage the chaos of feeding 6 people with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything, as though panic were a luxury she had decided, long ago, she could not afford to indulge. It was Wade beginning sentences, "Sarah Jane, I've been wanting to say," or "I ought to tell you," and stopping short every single time, until one evening in the 2nd month, mending a torn shirt of Amos's by the fire, while Wade sat across from her pretending to read a ledger he was not truly reading, she said, without lifting her eyes from her stitching. You do that. You start toward something, and then you climb back out of it before you've said the hard part. I've noticed it a dozen times now. He had gone very still and said nothing at all that night, but she had let the silence sit between them anyway, easy as an old chair by the fire, because grief, she had learned, opened some doors slower than others, and she was willing to wait. She did not call it falling in love, not even privately. She called it, when she let herself think of it at all, being useful in a house sorely in need of usefulness, and she told herself that was reward enough, because it had to be, because a woman in her position did not get to want more than the minimum required simply to keep breathing. She was wrong about that. She would learn exactly how wrong before the year turned over again. But first, the town of Millbrook Crossing would have its say, and Millbrook Crossing, embodied in one particular woman, had no intention whatsoever of letting a hired cook's quiet place in that household turn into something more. Her name was Ottilie Marsh, and she was married to the man who ran the Millbrook Crossing Bank, and she had appointed herself, some years back, the keeper of every social standard the town possessed. She organized the Ladies' Aid basket drives. She decided, with a raised eyebrow here and a pointed silence there, whose misfortune deserved sympathy and whose deserved only quiet judgment. She had, in the 16 months since Clara Calloway's death, made it her particular project to see the widower rancher and his 4 motherless children properly cared for, by which she meant cared for by a woman of her own choosing, namely her unmarried cousin Loretta, a sweet, biddable young woman. Ottilie had been quietly steering toward the Calloway ranch for the better part of a year, patient as a woman, steering a good milk cow toward the barn at dusk. The presence of a live-in cook, a widow no less, and one Ottilie noted with a sniff at the next Ladies' Aid meeting, was entirely too free with those children, entirely too settled in that kitchen, for a woman only drawing wages was an obstacle. Ottilie Marsh had no intention of tolerating without a fight. It started, as it always starts, with whispers. She built on those whispers steadily, week over week, gathering fresh material from every small domestic detail that reached her ears through the town's tangled network of hired girls and delivery boys and church pew neighbors, until the whispers had grown teeth, and Millbrook Crossing itself began to feel to Sarah Jane less like a town and more like a hand slowly tightening around her throat. Amos came home from the feed store one afternoon with his jaw set too hard and his eyes too bright, the particular posture of a boy trying not to weep in public. And when Sarah Jane gently pressed him, the dam finally broke. They said. His voice cracked, despite his best effort to hold it steady. Old Mrs. Pruitt at the feed counter said, "You're only sweet on Pa on account of his money." Said no, cook stays 4 months in one house unless she's got her sights set higher than the pantry. Said, and here his 14-year-old composure gave out entirely. Said Mama would be ashamed, seeing how close you've gotten to us. Sarah Jane set down the bread she'd been kneading, wiped her hands on her apron, and pulled the boy into her arms the way she imagined Clara Calloway might have done, though she had never known the woman and told herself she had no right to imagine any such thing. "Your mama," she said quietly, "would want you fed and warm and loved, and not carrying this whole ranch on your back at 14. That's the only thing I know for certain. The rest is just talk, and talk's never once put supper on a table, so we won't be giving it room in our heads tonight." But that night alone, in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers, she cried silently, breaking her own rule for the first time in longer than she could remember, because the whispers had found the one soft place her wall had never quite managed to cover, the fear, sitting patient under everything, that she had let herself become something she had no earthly right to be in that house, and that the whole town could see it plainer than she could see it in herself. She resolved, that night, to rebuild the wall, stone by stone. She would keep her distance. She would remember her place. She would remember that she was only good for cooking, and that a cook who forgot her place brought trouble down on children who had already suffered more than enough of it. That resolution held for exactly 9 days, until the flood. It came in hard and fast in late September, the kind of storm that builds all afternoon under a sky gone the color of a day-old bruise and then breaks all at once after dark, and the creek that ran along the low pasture rose faster than anyone on the ranch had seen it rise in a decade. Sarah Jane woke to the sound of Wade shouting for the hands to move the cattle off the bottomland, and to baby Thomas screaming louder than she had ever heard him scream. And by the time she reached the nursery, she found water already seeping under the back door of the house itself, and Nate frozen in the hallway, unable to make a single sound, to call for help, his mouth open on a scream that simply would not come. There is no time, in a moment like that, for a wall. There is no time for rules about minimums and credit given away. Sarah Jane scooped up the baby in one arm and grabbed Nate's hand with the other, and half-carried, half-dragged both children up the stairs to the second floor, where Amos was already herding Della and Ivy toward higher ground, shouting instructions in a voice gone suddenly, frighteningly like his father's. The water rose through the first floor of the ranch house before it finally crested and began, with agonizing slowness, to recede. The kitchen where Sarah Jane had cooked 4 months of meals was ruined. The pantry stores half floated away. The good rugs Clara Calloway had brought from her own mother's house soaked through and beyond saving. But the house stood, and the children stood, all 4 of them huddled together on the stairwell landing in their nightclothes. And it was Sarah Jane who held that huddle together through the long, wet hours before dawn, who kept the baby quiet against her shoulder, who kept Nate's hand in hers and Ivy pressed against her side and let Della, for once, lean against her without pretending she didn't need to. When the gray dawn finally broke over waterlogged pastures and a house that smelled of mud and river silt, Wade Calloway came in from a night spent in the saddle helping his men save what cattle could be saved, soaked through and hollow-eyed with exhaustion, and he stopped in the hallway in front of Sarah Jane and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has only just understood. He cannot survive losing. "You didn't have to do all that," he said, his voice rough with a night's shouting over rain. "I did," Sarah Jane said simply. "They're my children too, long as I'm under this roof." She heard herself say it and felt a flush rise in her cheeks, because it was more than she had any claim to, and she braced for him to correct her gently, to remind her she was hired help and the children were his and his alone. He did not correct her. He only nodded slowly the way a man sets down a fact he intends to keep hold of, and said, "I know they are," and turned to go see to the horses, leaving Sarah Jane standing in that mud-smelling hallway with her heart going harder than it had at any point during the flood itself. That should have been the turning point. In a fairer world, it would have been. But Ottilie Marsh heard about the flood the very next day, the way she heard everything within a day of its happening. And instead of relief that the children had come through safe, she found in the story a fresh angle to work. "A cook," she said to her ladies' aid circle, her needle pausing delicately over her sampler. Up on the second floor of a widower's house in the middle of the night, in her nightclothes with all 4 children and no other grown woman present. I do wonder what Mr. Calloway's late wife's own mother would make of such an arrangement were word ever to reach her. She let the sentence hang unfinished in the air, the way a stone hangs just before it breaks the surface of still water, and watched the ripple of it spread exactly as she had intended. Within the week, word had reached the bank. Mr. Silas Marsh, Ottilie's husband, held the note on the Calloway Ranch's western water rights, secured 2 years back when Wade had expanded his herd and needed the additional grazing the water access would support, a note that had, until that week, been a matter of routine and unremarkable renewal. Wade Calloway had never once missed a payment in his life. But a note is a note, and a banker under sufficient domestic pressure can always locate a technicality to justify calling one due ahead of schedule, and Silas Marsh, worn down by a wife determined that the Calloway household required a firmer guiding hand than it currently possessed. The letter came on a Wednesday. Wade read it standing at the kitchen table amid the flood's lingering wreckage, his face going the particular still gray color of a man doing arithmetic he badly does not want to be doing, and when Sarah Jane asked what troubled him, he did not do what he always did. He did not begin a sentence and abandon it before the hard part. He told her everything. The note called due in 4 weeks, full payment, or the Western Water Rights access. That half his herd depended on to survive a dry winter would revert entirely to the bank. 4 weeks was nowhere near enough time to sell sufficient cattle at fair market price without gutting the breeding stock he'd spent a decade building. 4 weeks, Wade said quietly, staring at the letter as though sheer will might rearrange its words into something kinder, is about how long it takes a certain kind of woman to decide she doesn't care for the company her neighbor keeps. This is on account of me, Sarah Jane said. It was not a question. This is on account of small people nursing small grudges, Wade said, and for the first time since she'd known him, real heat came into his voice, banked low and dangerous as coals under ash. This has nothing to do with you, Sarah Jane, and everything to do with a woman who can't abide the world moving in any direction she didn't personally order up. But lying awake that night, Sarah Jane could not quite make herself believe him all the way through. Her wall, the one she had spent 4 months letting fall apart stone by stone, went back up overnight hard and complete, because here, surely, was the proof of exactly what she had always known, that a woman like her, wanting a life like this one, brought ruin down on people who deserved so much better than ruin. She did not tell Wade what she decided. She simply began. The very next morning, quietly making her plans to go. She was 2 days into those plans, a half-written letter to a distant aunt who might know of a position further west, her traveling bundle pulled out and dusted off from under her bed, when Nate found her. The boy came into her small room at dusk, silent as ever, and set something down on the bed beside her. It was a fresh drawing, not scratched into dirt this time, but drawn carefully in charcoal on a scrap of paper Amos must have given him from the ranch ledger stock, and when Sarah Jane unfolded it, her breath caught hard in her throat. It was the whole family rendered in careful, wobbling, achingly earnest lines. 4 children and 1 tall man, and standing among them, unmistakably, a woman with her hair pinned up and an apron at her waist, her arms spread wide enough to gather every one of them in. "Nate," she whispered. "Nate, honey, can you tell me what this means?" Nathaniel Calloway, who had not spoken a single word since his mother's funeral, looked up at her with enormous solemn eyes and said in a small, rusted, unpracticed voice, "Stay." Sarah Jane cried then openly, for the second time in longer than she cared to count, and she held that silent boy until he was not quite so silent anymore, and she understood, in that single moment, that whatever wall she had built to survive her own grief was never going to hold up against a household that had already quietly, without asking her leave, decided she belonged inside it. She unpacked her bundle that night, but the note at the bank still stood, and 4 weeks had become 3, and Ottilie Marsh's whispers had not stopped simply because a flood had passed and a mute boy had found one word to say. If anything, they grew sharper, curdling now into something with real teeth, because word had spread that Wade Calloway was in financial trouble, and there is no crueler sport in a small town than watching a proud man totter, especially with a woman like Ottilie Marsh standing ready to point out precisely whose fault it was. The 3 weeks that followed tested every ounce of quiet competence Sarah Jane Whitfield possessed, and every ounce of stubborn silence Wade Calloway had built his whole adult life around, and by the time they were through, both of them understood that surviving a crisis side by side, and choosing to stay together once it passed, were 2 entirely different kinds of courage. Wade did not tell the children the full weight of what the bank's letter meant, not at first because he believed a burden handed to a child too young to carry it was, not honesty but cowardice wearing honesty's coat. But children who have already lost one parent to circumstances beyond their understanding are rarely so unaware as the adults around them hope. Amos, keeping the ranch's accounts in his careful 14-year-old hand because his father had taught him to, and someone in that house needed to track every dollar, found the banker's letter tucked in his father's desk while hunting for a spare pencil, and read it twice before its meaning fully landed, and did not sleep at all that night. He came to Sarah Jane before sunup, hollow-eyed, and laid the letter on the kitchen table between them. "He's going to lose the water rights," Amos said, his voice held admirably steady, the voice of a boy who had trained the panic out of himself the way you train a green colt out of shying, through sheer patient repetition. "Half his range comes summer, if the herd can't get to water, and it's on account of the marshes, isn't it? On account of what they've been saying about you and Pa." Sarah Jane considered lying to him. She considered it for the length of one held breath, because Amos was 14 and had already shouldered more than any child ought to, and here was one more hard truth being set before him at the kitchen table before sunrise. But she had built her whole life since her husband's death around the conviction that hard truth was owed to those who had already earned it through their own suffering, and Amos Calloway had earned this one several times over. "Yes," she said, "I believe that's exactly why." Amos's jaw did not tremble this time. Something harder settled into his young face instead, something that looked, for just a moment, uncannily like his father's stillness in the instant before he made up his mind about a thing. "Then we'll have to fix it," Amos said. "Won't we?" It was Amos, in fact, who first floated the idea that would eventually turn the whole crisis on its head, though it would take another 10 days and no small amount of suffering before it bore any fruit. He remembered his mother speaking once before she took sick of a demand down at the rail depot in the county seat for good preserved and smoked goods sold to the hotels and the supply houses that fed travelers coming through on the cars, and of how she'd once spoken of setting up such a trade herself using the ranch's own surplus. "Before there was ever time, you cook better than any woman in this county," Amos said, with the blunt confidence of a boy who has decided to believe in something because the alternative is unbearable. "What if we did what Mama always talked about doing? It would not alone save water rights on a bank's 4-week clock." Sarah Jane knew enough sums to see that plainly, but it was something where the day before there had been nothing, and it gave a whole grieving household a single shared task to pour itself into, which mattered, in the end, nearly as much as the money itself. What followed was 10 days, Sarah Jane would count, for the rest of her life, among the hardest and finest she ever lived through. The whole family, all 4 children, and before long, Wade himself, coming in from a long day in the saddle to find his ruined kitchen rebuilt into something like a small working factory. Jars boiling and great washtubs salvaged from the flood. The whole house thick with the smell of vinegar and brown sugar and hickory smoke, threw themselves into putting up preserves and smoking whatever meat could be spared, packing the goods into crates bound on consignment through a depot supplier Sarah Jane had once known from her married years. A man named Emmett Fowler, who remembered her cooking from a barn dance years back, and was willing as both favor and gamble to carry her goods. Della, whose fury had for months found no outlet but small destructions, discovered she had a genuine gift for the hard physical labor of it, hauling wood, tending the smoke fires at all hours, work that let a girl burn her grief off through her arms and back instead of her temper, and something in her settled over those 10 days in a way Sarah Jane had been quietly praying for since the day she arrived. Nate found that calling out jar counts and stacking labels asked nothing emotional of him and therefore came easier than ordinary talk, until by the 4th day he was speaking almost freely, at least within the walls of that kitchen. Little Ivy, put in charge of wiping jars clean and fetching corks, grew too busy and too proud of her usefulness to dwell quite so hard on her fear of forgetting, and even baby Thomas, propped in his basket where he could watch the whole loud operation, cried less in those 10 days than he had in the 4 months prior. Din, whatever fashion infants understand such things, that the house around him had finally found its feet, And Wade. Wade came in from the range those 10 evenings to find his once silent house full of noise and steam, and his children actually laughing, a sound that House had very nearly forgotten it knew how to make, and he took to standing in the kitchen doorway some nights a full minute before anyone noticed he was there, just watching, his face working through something complicated he had no words ready for, and did not try to find any. On the 7th night he finally came all the way into the kitchen instead of lingering at its edge, and picked up a ladle without being asked, and began stirring a pot of preserves at Sarah Jane's side, the same way he had once, weeks back, picked up a wet rag to help with the flood cleanup unasked. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, echoing, without seeming to know he did it, the very word she'd once said to him in that mud-smelling dawn. "Pa, I did," Sarah Jane said, echoing her own answer right back at him, and she caught the corner of his mouth move. Not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow that her chest went warm and tight together. "Sarah Jane." He said her name and then stopped, the way he always stopped, and she waited, ladle in hand, giving him whatever silence he needed to fill in his own time. "These 3 weeks, if it comes to it, if the water rights go, I need you to know that isn't the thing I'm afraid of losing." He did not finish it. He never finished the sentences that came near the vulnerable part. But this time, for the first time, he had come close enough that Sarah Jane understood plainly what the unfinished half would have said, and she set the ladle down and reached over and laid her hand over his on the handle of the pot and said, quiet and steady, "I know. I'm not going anywhere, Wade. Whatever happens with the land." That was as far as either of them went that night, because some truths need a good long while to walk clear across a room, but it was further than either of them had ever gone, and it was enough, that night, to carry them both to sleep. The preserves and smoked goods sold through within the week, every crate moved by Emmett Fowler true to his word, and the little venture that had begun as a grieving family's way of feeling useful together brought in the end, a genuinely meaningful sum, not the whole of what the bank demanded, not nearly, but a real dent driven into it. And more than that, proof, when Wade rode into the county seat to make his partial payment and lay out a longer repayment schedule before a board that included men beyond Silas Marsh alone, that the Calloway operation was solvent and industrious and very much not the failing household Ottilie Marsh had been quietly suggesting it was. 2 of the other board members, men who had known Wade's own father and respected the son in his own right, pushed back hard against calling the whole note due on schedule, arguing there was no sound business sense in ruining a paying rancher over what plainly amounted to a personal grudge. Caught between his wife's campaign and his own board's plain arithmetic, was forced to grant the extension. The water rights for now were safe. But Ottilie Marsh was not a woman inclined to accept defeat quietly, and the near loss of the Western water rights had only sharpened her resolve rather than blunted it. If money could not pry Sarah Jane Whitfield loose from that household, then reputation would simply have to finish the job instead. And reputation, Ottilie had learned across a long career of small-town social maneuvering, was a far more efficient weapon than any banknote, since it needed no signature, no board approval, no proof of any kind at all, only the right words, said to the right people, at exactly the right volume. It was at the church social held to mark the safe end of harvest, 3 weeks after the note had been renegotiated, that Ottilie Marsh made her move out in the open, in front of half the town, in a manner that could not be quietly walked back by whispers alone. The social was held under a stretch of lantern light strung between 2 oaks in the churchyard, tables groaning under the town's collected cooking, children weaving between adult legs, a fiddler tuning up for the evening's dancing. Sarah Jane had come with the Calloway children at Wade's own particular insistence. "You'll come as family," he had told her simply, the closest he had yet come to naming outright what she had become to that household. And she wore her one good dress, a soft gray wool, and had spent the walk-over feeling something dangerously close to happiness, which ought to have warned her, if anything could have, that trouble was riding in close behind. Audley Marsh waited until the tables were fully laid and half the town had gathered near the lemonade to make her play, pitching her voice just loud enough to carry across a wide circle without seeming, to any casual onlooker, to be raising it at all, a skill she had spent decades perfecting to a fine edge. "I do think it's a generous thing," she said to no one in particular, and everyone at once, "when a man takes in charity cases under his own roof. Mr. First K. Calloway's dear late wife would be so gratified, I'm sure, to see a common cook standing about at the harvest social in her own good gray dress, though I understand the dress was purchased with household funds. One does wonder what else gets drawn from those accounts for a woman with no more real claim on that family than her wages entitle her to." The words found their mark exactly where Audley intended, the soft, unguarded place where a woman's entire worth could be reduced, in a single sentence, to a transaction. Hired wages, a borrowed dress, charity dressed up as belonging. Sarah Jane felt the blood drain clean out of her face. She felt every eye in that circle swing toward her, felt Amos's hand grip her arm hard enough to leave a mark, felt the whole warm evening turn suddenly, achingly cold around her. She had a rule: never let them see you cry. She held to it now harder than she ever had before, though it cost her dearly, because this time there were children watching who loved her, and she would not let them see her broken by a woman like Audley Marsh. "You're quite right that I'm only good for cooking," Sarah Jane said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I've never once claimed to be anything more than that. And I don't believe I need to be anything more to have earned my place looking after those children when they needed looking after, or to have earned my place at this social, the same as any soul standing here tonight." It was a fine answer. It was not, in the eyes of a churchyard crowd Audley Marsh had spent years carefully cultivating, quite enough on its own to overturn the accusation, and Sarah Jane felt the circle tighten inward around her. That particular narrowing of a crowd making up its collective mind which side of a story to believe. And that was when Wade Calloway, who had been standing 20 feet off in conversation with two of his hands, turned and saw his family ringed and cornered, and crossed that churchyard in a way that silenced every conversation in his path. Because a man built like Wade Calloway crossing a crowd wearing that particular look on his face was not a sight Millbrook Crossing had ever once witnessed, and it hushed the whole yard more completely than any words could have managed. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But when he spoke, every soul in that churchyard heard him plain. "Mrs. Bree Marsh," he said, "I'll thank you to leave off discussing my household accounts, seeing as you've never once been invited to review them, and I'll thank you further to leave off discussing the woman standing beside my children, since she's done more for this family in 4 months than half this town managed in the 16 months before she ever arrived. Myself included in that reckoning." He paused, and the pause carried real weight, the weight of a man who had spent 16 months not finishing his sentences, and had finally decided to see one all the way through. "Sarah Jane Whitfield carried my children up out of a flooding house with her own 2 hands. She's fed them and clothed them and coaxed my silent boy back into speaking, and she poured more of her own sweat into saving this ranch than any hand on my payroll. If that makes her a charity case in your eyes, Marsh, then I'd say the charity's been running in the opposite direction the whole while, and it's this family that's been on the receiving end of it." Audley Marsh's face ran through several unflattering colors in quick succession, and she opened her mouth to answer and found, for perhaps the first occasion in her long career of social combat, that she had nothing at all ready to say. It was into that silence that another voice spoke up, one that startled the crowd even more than Wade's had, because it belonged to Audley Marsh's own housekeeper, a broad, quiet woman named Greta Voss, who had kept house for the Marshes 11 years and had never once, in all that time, been heard to contradict her employer and company. "If I might say," Greta said, stepping forward, wringing her apron in both hands, but standing her ground all the same, "I've heard Mrs. Marsh's opinion of Mrs. Whitfield a fair number of times over the supper dishes these past weeks, and I've held my tongue on account of it not being my place. But I've also heard from my own niece who takes in washing from the Calloway place exactly what that woman's done for those children, and I don't believe it's a Christian thing, ma'am. Begging pardon, to tear down a widow at honest work simply on account of her not fitting your notion of who ought to stand beside a well-off man. My own mother cooked in a fine house 30 years running, and was never once less than a decent woman on account of it." She stopped, red to the ears at her own boldness, but did not take a word of it back. The crowd's tightened ring, which had been closing in around Sarah Jane, began instead slowly to loosen and turn, the particular reversal of a small town's judgment the moment it senses it has been standing on the wrong side of a story, and old man Higgins, a rancher pushing 80 who had known 3 generations of both the Calloway and Marsh families, cleared his throat to add, in his slow, creaking voice, that he'd always found it a poor kind of Christian charity that only ever extended to folks who had plenty to spare already, and that in his considerable experience it was generally the woman with the least left over who did the most actual saving, and a good many heads nodded along at that. And the fiddler, sensing the moment had turned entirely, struck up a lively reel, and the harvest social carried on around Audley Marsh's stiff and humiliated silence like a creek closing back over a dropped stone. She left early that evening, her husband trailing behind her wearing an expression of long-suffering apology aimed at anyone who would meet his eye, and Millbrook Crossing for its part spent the balance of that harvest social falling over itself to make up for lost time, pressing plates of food on Sarah Jane and warm words alongside them. Several of those words thinly enough disguised as compliments that she had to hide a smile behind her hand more than once. Wade found her afterward, out at the edge of the lantern light, where she had slipped away a moment to let her heart settle back into its rhythm. "I ought to have said something sooner," he told her, "months sooner. I let you carry that whole weight alone, because I didn't trust myself to say it right, and I'm sorry for that failing." "You said it exactly right tonight," Sarah Jane said. "That's further than most men manage in a whole lifetime." Sarah Jane. He started her name the way he always did, and this time he did not stop partway through it. "I'm not a man with any gift for words, and I don't expect I ever will be. Not the way you deserve. But I know this much plainly. That house was a grave before you ever set foot in it. Every one of us was only going through the motions of living inside it, and you didn't mend that by being clever, nor by being anything other than exactly what you already are. You mended it by staying, by choosing to stay day after day when nobody on this earth would have blamed you for going. I don't want to cook, Sarah Jane. I haven't wanted only that since about the 2nd month. I want you. However, you'll have me." There, under the lantern light with the fiddle playing and the whole town's freshly repentant goodwill washing warm around them both, Sarah Jane Whitfield finally let her wall come the rest of the way down. And this time she did not cry from sorrow, but from the particular relief of a woman who has spent 2 long years believing herself unworthy of exactly this, and finding out at long last that she had been wrong the whole while. "I'll have you," she said, "for as long as you'll keep me." "The rest of my life," Wade said, "if you'll let me offer you that much of it." They were married the following spring, in that same churchyard, beneath a sky washed clean by an early morning rain, and every one of the 4 Calloway children stood at the front of that small gathering, Amos no longer carrying a whole household alone on shoulders still growing into themselves, but sharing the weight now with a mother who had chosen to take up half of it. Della, her fury settled at last into something closer to her father's own steadiness, save for the rare flare that still rose in her, and was still, always now met with patience rather than punishment. Nate speaking freely now in whole and ordinary sentences, though he still kept in his spare hours a hand for drawing, because some things are told better in pictures than in words, even once the words have come back. Little Ivy, no longer afraid of forgetting, having learned from Sarah Jane herself that love does not require perfect memory in order to stay alive in a person's heart, walking now on sturdy, unsteady legs among his brothers and sister. no longer the household's barometer for sorrow, because there was by then so very little sorrow left in that house for any barometer to measure. Audley Marsh did not attend the wedding, though her husband did, sent along by a board of bank directors who understood a good deal better than his wife ever had, which side of a ledger it paid a sensible man to stand on. Greta Voss came and wept through the whole of the ceremony, and old man Higgins delivered a toast at the small gathering afterward that ran a full 20 minutes past what anyone had expected of him, and that not one soul present minded in the slightest. Years on, when the Callaway Ranch had grown wider still, and its cattle were spoken of with respect across 4 counties, and when Amos had grown into a young man who ran his father's books with the very same steady competence he'd shown as a boy, and Della had taken over the breeding operation herself with a gentleness that surprised everyone who still remembered her furious childhood, and Nate had married a quiet young woman who kept every drawing he ever gave her, framed on her own kitchen wall, and Ivy had grown tall and easy and entirely unafraid, and baby Thomas had grown into a boy who carried not one single memory of the grief that had once filled that house, because there had been none left over by the time he was old enough to notice it. In those later years, it was old man Higgins, rocking on his own porch, who liked best to tell the story to any young soul willing to sit still and listen. The story of the cook who arrived at a grieving ranch with nothing but a bundle on her back and a wall built up around a heart she believed had no more claim to being loved, and who was told by half a county that she was only good for cooking, and only a widow, and only a woman without enough standing in the world to matter. They had her dead wrong, the old man would say, rocking slow, looking out over land that had once very nearly slipped away over a spiteful banker's note. On account of being only good for cooking, never once stopped her being everything else besides, a mother to children who badly needed one, a wife to a man who'd forgotten how to hope for one. A whole home, built up clean out of nothing but her own 2 hands and her own stubborn refusal to believe the worst thing anybody ever said about her. He would pause here, the way old men do when they've come round to the part of a story that matters most to them personally, and add, quieter now, near to himself. That's the plain truth about a home, you understand. It was never about the house itself, nor the land, nor the money sitting in some bank vault. It was about somebody staying when the leaving would have come so much easier on account of they'd decided you were worth staying for. That's the whole of what home ever really is, when you get down past all the rest of it. Somebody deciding you're worth the staying. And then he'd fall quiet and rock and watch the sun go down gold over the Callaway Range, satisfied he'd told it the way it rightly deserved telling, which is to say, honest, and all the way through to its true and proper end.